All right, what's going on, folks? Welcome to another episode of the Adventure One podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I wanted to take a moment to do another gear episode. So if you just like hearing hunting stories, adventure stories, stories of travel to faraway, exciting places, this may not be the episode for you. Go check out one of the camping or hunting or other adventure podcasts. But if you like hearing about gear, what people are using in the field, how specific configurations are set up on a rifle for a very specific purpose, you like accuracy, you like long-range shooting, and you just like shooting guns in general, this episode is for you. So a while back during hunting season, I did an episode all about my hunting rifle. It was a longer episode, and I talked more and more about my hunting rifle than I ever thought I could. It was kind of the back end behind all the decisions I made in the process of configuring that rifle the way I did over several years. It was lessons learned, trying out gear, switching things around, and ultimately how it ended up the way it did with the optic on it, the bipod, the sling, everything that was on it, even the ammo I was using, why I was using each particular item, and kind of how it ended up that way. And that was great for hunting season, but deer season has come and gone. So in Texas, we can go out and we can shoot pigs or go out and shoot exotics. I just did an episode with Kyle and Mario talking about their South Texas axis hunt, which was all kinds of cool. And there's a chance I may be able to get to hunt exotics this spring, but pigs are always fair game, and target shooting is also always fair game. And so often, if you're like me, I get bored by target shooting. I use it almost as just a mechanical and scientific process just to go check a rifle. So I'll put a new optic on something, I'll put a new muzzle brake on something. I'm just kind of messing with gear, tweaking things, and that will be the reason why I'm going to the range. I just want to check something out, test something, make sure it works. Maybe test out 2 different loads of ammo, see which one's better, stuff like that. But rarely do I go to the range just for fun anymore. And I think that's something that I kind of miss, because every new shooter kind of got introduced to it generally by going to the range. By going to the range and just learning about different guns and learning, hey, these are pretty cool. You can be safe, you can shoot a target, you can have a lot of fun, you can challenge yourself to try to be more accurate. But I think as you kind of advance and your skill set increases, like anything, as you kind of move up, it gets a little bit boring. You want other challenges, you want other environments. And I think so often ranges, especially here in Dallas where I live, they're so heavily controlled that they feel almost like they're so focused on kind of the babysitting aspect of it. They're trying to encourage new shooters to come to the range, which is great, and they want everybody to be safe, which obviously is great, but it feels so contained because of that there's really a limit to what you can do there. And so that's why I kind of view it as, yep, I want to go shoot a target at 100 yards, make sure things work. Okay, that's all I can do here. Now, there are ranges, if you go a little further out, that'll let you do more, but I just don't get to go frequent them as much. So in the off season, when it's not time to shoot deer, how can you pull out your rifle and go have fun? For me, the answer was long-range shooting, target shooting, putting the emphasis on being more precise and reaching out to distances. And that required me to find new places to do it, which was difficult, and that could probably be an episode all on its own. Typically, I like just finding a place where there's open pasture or a lease or some place where you're just allowed to shoot that's not necessarily a controlled range. Now, you obviously need to be careful when you're doing that, making sure you're shooting into some sort of berm or backstop, or at least shooting downhill enough that it's going into a side hill, something like that. But long-range shooting is a great way to kind of hone your skill set in the off-season and to have some fun while challenging yourself. So I wanted to talk about my long-range precision rifle setup. So looking at my rifle, going through what's on here, why I put it on here, kind of how things ended up the way they did, and what I like, what I don't like, and maybe some advice or suggestions or some shortcuts if you're looking to kind of do something like this on your own. You can learn from my experiences. So first off, what got me into this? What made me want to shoot long range? I think originally it all started with hunting, and then it was a desire to challenge myself a little bit further. And maybe it has something to do with all the sniper movies and stuff that were coming out a couple of years ago. I think everybody in the gun industry kind of got a little bit excited by those. But I don't think it's necessarily because of those as much as what they tap into. They tap into just the cool factor of seeing a target a long way away hit by a bullet that you very precisely sent there. And just the ability to do something with such precision, such control, such accuracy, and affect something way, way far away is just downright cool. And so I kind of knew the limits of my hunting rifle, and I wanted something that wasn't necessarily built for hunting. I wanted something that was accurate, precise, but could be used just for shooting targets. I could take it to the range and have fun. So a couple of years ago, I actually did a review. It was a T&E gun of a Rock River LAR-8 chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor. And this rifle was probably one of the very first production 6.5 Creedmoor AR-10 builds. And I was really interested in this gun. 6.5 Creedmoor had been around a little while, but this was, like I said, I think it was 3 years ago before it was starting really to be really popular. And I really fell in love with the cartridge quickly, and it was a joy to shoot. And I realized that saying that I shot 6.5 Creedmoor before it was cool is about the most hipster thing you can say in the gun industry. But whatever, I'll own it. It is what it is. So I shot that gun. It was really accurate for an AR-10. I was really impressed with it. But because it was an AR-10, it was really chunky for what it was. And I realized, well, for a semi-automatic rifle, I had an AR-15 that was honestly a lot better for just shooting rounds quickly, whether that's pig hunting, whether that's just going to the range and messing around. I really just wanted precision. So that brought me back to bolt action rifles. So I started looking at bolt action stuff in the 6.5 Creedmoor chambering. And of course, if you followed my channel for a while, you know that I'm a lefty. So bolt action stuff can get a little bit difficult. So I just kind of went to explore, see what's out there. So a couple requirements. I wanted something that had a heavy barrel on it. I didn't want a hunting weight barrel. I already had that in my 270 hunting rifle. I already had that in an AR-15. I've got another AR-15 that shoots actually very accurately for what it is. So I wanted something that was dedicated towards precision, and a good barrel is the number one way to do that. Now, of course, there are lots of aftermarket barrel options, but I wanted to get something that was production level from the factory, really as good as it could be. And this is when long-range shooting was kind of starting to have an uptick in popularity. So manufacturers were just starting to come out with more and more items. Now, in early 2020, when I'm recording this, there are so many options. There has never been a better time to look at something like this. But a couple years ago, it was just starting to get popular. And in left-hand bolt, it was pretty tough to find stuff. So the Ruger Precision Rifle had just come out, and a coworker of mine got one, and he loved it. For a factory rifle that came with essentially a chassis, it's not truly a chassis, but it's a similar kind of monolithic aluminum stock type setup. Heavy barrel, bolt action, very accurate rifle that was $1,000. That was pretty exciting. But guess what? They didn't make it in left-handed. And I'm a big fan of Ruger stuff, but unfortunately, they just didn't have that at the time. So I started looking at other rifles that had features that I liked that were built in left-handed configurations. So, of course, there's Remington. But again, I know a lot of people who are Remington fanboys. I'm not one of them. Growing up, I mean, I shot my uncle's Remington Model 7. That's what I killed my first deer with, and several deer then after. I'm not going to say Remingtons are a bad rifle. They're not, because they're not. It's just not my thing. I don't have any particular love for them. To me, it's just a generic bolt-action rifle platform. It's like the equivalent of what a Glock is. So it's a good pistol, but it's generic and it's nothing special. But it's good and it absolutely gets the job done. So I wanted something that was a little bit more catered towards what I wanted, and I wanted something that was pretty easy to configure going forward. So I kind of avoided the Remingtons for the time being, even though it would have been a really good platform for me to buy maybe an old Target model 700 short action and then completely build up from kind of the ground up, putting my own stock on it, stuff like that. But again, I didn't really want to start there with my project. I wanted to start with a factory rifle designed for long-range precision that already had some of the features I want and then just customize the rest of it. So then I looked at Sako and Tikka. Some good options there, but still kind of expensive for what it was. There are some really interesting Tikka T3 models that I was heavily considering. But then ultimately, I ended up finding the Savage Model 10 BA Stealth. So the Savage Model 10 action has been around for ages. And it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. Just because the way that action works is just rock solid, it's accurate, and it's affordable for Savage to manufacture. So that's why they've been making it for a long time and why it's pretty popular, because it sells at a good price. And I have shot Savages before, and I'm particularly a fan of the Savage AccuTrigger. Even on some of their entry-level rifles, all the way up to their nicer-end rifles, that AccuTrigger, just the adjustability of it, I'm a big fan. So to me, having that Savage AccuTrigger meant I probably would not need to do a trigger job. I liked the 10 action, and I really liked the barrel, how the barrel attached on Savage rifles. So they use a large external barrel nut so that they can really time that barrel and get it set very precisely. It's very easy to adjust, and when it comes time to replace a barrel, it's pretty easy to do. You basically just unscrew the barrel nut, twist out the barrel, and then drop a new one in. So I wanted something that had a good barrel from the factory. I didn't plan on changing it, but I knew running a 6.5 Creedmoor for a long period of time in a target setup, eventually I was going to need to change out a barrel. So I wanted a system that was at least fairly friendly to do that. And something else I liked about this rifle is it came with a really nice chassis from the factory. And so this is part of the BA Stealth configuration. I don't actually know what the BA stands for. I think everybody just assumes it means badass. That's what I'm going to assume. I don't actually think I've ever seen it written out anywhere. Now, I know there's the BA Stealth Model 10, but then there's also the Ashbury Precision Model 10, which was kind of a collaboration. It's a very similar rifle, but a little bit different just based on kind of the special edition collaboration. But I recognized the chassis that came on the BA Stealth, and I recognized that it was incredibly similar to some stuff made by MDT, which is Modular Driven Technologies, which is a great company that's been making this high-end stuff for quite a while. They sell a lot of it direct to consumer, they sell some of it to dealers, and yes, they do OEM sales as well. So the Savage 10 BA Stealth, I'm about 95% sure that this chassis is sold to them by MDT, and it's one of their factory chassis. They just change a little bit of the texturing, and they engrave a big fat Savage logo in the side. So what's the advantage of having a gun built on a solid aluminum chassis? Well, it's just a little bit of a shortcut to accuracy, to be honest. You can have a really accurate wood stock rifle. You can have a really accurate fiberglass stock rifle. Hell, Macmillan's been doing it for a long time. And even with just a regular nylon injection molded synthetic stock, you can get a rifle to be really accurate if you do it just right. What I like about the aluminum chassis is you kind of don't have to do it just right. So these things are CNC machined from a solid billet of aluminum, so the final production is incredibly consistent. They don't swell in cold or moist, humid air like wood tends to do, and the whole thing can just be rigid, rock solid, and blueprinted to your action so that it fits it exactly, so that you really don't need to bed your rifle. And if you're not familiar with what I mean by bedding your rifle, typically it's either pillar bedding or glass bedding. It's basically where you remove the barreled action from the stock and you use some sort of a filler, either a glass compound or aluminum pillars, to change how the barreled action contacts the stock so that it contacts the action in a way that's rock solid, so that there's no gaps or wiggle room, so that it's just very rigid and very consistent. So with a chassis system, that's kind of done already in the CNC machining process, and you don't really have to do anything like that. And it's just a super, super sturdy platform. So I was excited when I found that this basically used the MDT chassis, and I also liked that that chassis was M-LOK compatible. So if you're not familiar with M-LOK, there are a couple different modular systems for bolting junk onto your rifle. So we're all familiar with ARs that have, the old style quad rails that went all the way up the handguard. So, yep, it's great to have Picatinny rails everywhere, but it's even better to not have them where you don't need them and only have them where you want them. So there have been a couple designs that have let you put Picatinny rails in different places, but M-LOK and KeyMod were a modular system, just like almost like shelving you would get from the Container Store, that allow you to add any accessory in a variety of places. So you can add things where you want them, and where you don't want anything, you can leave it bare. And it's actually somewhat skeletonized, so it retains a pretty lightweight platform for being made out of a solid hunk of metal. So I was excited about that combination of an accurate bolt action in a nice chassis system with M-LOK, so I could start adding stuff to it. And of course, with any long-range precision setup, the next thing guys will naturally look at is the optic. And some people will throw out rules like you should pay at least as much for your optic as you should for your rifle. Or some people even say you should pay twice as much for your optic as you should for your rifle. I think there are no hard and fast rules. I think stuff like that used to be more true than it is today. But the rifle market is incredibly competitive now, with some limited but large players, but the optic market is more competitive than it has ever been. Global sourcing has gotten really, really efficient, and there are just so many options from so many players that I think what you can get on a budget has really increased. So when I set this rifle up initially, I mounted the TrueGlow Eminus 16. So it's a cheaper rifle scope. It's about $350 for that scope. It's a 4-16 by 44, and it comes with a one-piece mount that's dedicated more for an AR type of build. So I would say this optic, it plays kind of in the class of Nikon, of Vortex, of some of the kind of mid-level Bushnells. For TrueGlow, it's one of their nicer optics, and it was a great way to start my kind of project with this rifle. And even with that cheap optic, man, I was really impressed by the accuracy I was getting out of this thing. Once I found the right ammo, I was definitely shooting MOA groups very easily, and if I tried hard on my part, sub-MOA groups. And I couldn't blame the optic for anything, really. In fact, the only reason I changed optics down the road is just when I started figuring out kind of feature sets that I really wanted. And so how kind of some of my opinions for the specific task this rifle was doing, how that changed a little bit. So when I had that optic, though, it came with that one-piece AR mount, which was just a little too tall for what I had on here. So I ended up going with Warn scope rings, and I've used Warn before. It's a good brand. They make quality stuff. They have lots of different options. I went with the medium rings. I don't know their exact name, but kind of their most common. I know there are some other systems that use the same lockup, but they basically have bolts that go all the way through top and bottom. So you're clamping the rail and you're clamping the scope at the same time with the same system. You don't have one set of screws that attaches to the rail and another set of screws that attaches to the scope. The whole thing is just held together as basically two halves with vertical connection points, so it just makes it rock solid. So they obviously have several different heights. I was using a 30 millimeter scope, so I was looking at the 30 millimeter series, and I ended up going with the medium height. It just barely fit with enough clearance, and so I would prefer a lower ring to a taller ring if they both fit, so I was excited that that would work. So went with the Warren, got that scope mounted onto the rail, and that was another thing that I liked about this Savage. From the factory, it came with a really nice one-piece rail. So I think for any rifle, but especially for something dedicated to long-range precision shooting, I really like a one-piece scope rail. Again, just kind of like the one-piece aluminum stock, when you have a single piece of metal, it makes it incredibly sturdy, incredibly just durable, rigid, and reliable, and there's no chance for misalignment between two separate pieces. So I highly suggest a one-piece rail. When I first got this set up, I actually took off the factory rail, and I didn't have any problems with it, but I wanted something with some angle built in. I knew that that would give me longer total range in terms of what I can do with this rifle. So I took that off and I went with an Evolution Gunworks 20 MOA rail, or EGW. You've probably seen it just abbreviated that way. So the EGW rail, really high quality for the price, just solid machining, good piece of gear. But when I got it dialed in and all set up, I found that with the 20 MOA mount, I could barely get my rifle zeroed at 100 yards. I basically topped out my scope. So what most long-range precision shooters would do, and it's actually very common, and I don't think enough people talk about it, but when you use a rail with a really steep angle like that, you don't really have enough adjustment range in a lot of these scopes to zero up close. Now, some scopes now, especially these 34 millimeter tubes and stuff like that, you have more adjustment range and it's not a problem. But a lot of 30 millimeter tube scopes, you would actually have to zero at 200 yards. So what's the problem? Why not just zero at 200 yards and then move on? I mean, the drop 200 yards and in is not that much. For me, it just came to kind of an issue of logistics and facilities. So there's a lot of ranges around me where I can go zero at 100 yards. So even in the city limits, I have places where I can take my rifle to a bench and just check it at 100 yards just to make sure it's on. And then from there, I can use my dope chart for various ranges. But there are not a lot of places where I can check it at 200. So the issue was more in what I knew I could test. I wanted the reliability and testability in my optic far more than I actually needed that slight advantage of the extra range that a 20 MOA mount could give me. So I took that EGW mount off and I put the factory mount back on. And I don't know if that factory mount on this rifle is actually made by Savage or if it's made by somebody else, sourced OEM and installed on here, but it is a high quality Picatinny rail mount and it is aluminum. But I don't think you necessarily need steel for something like this. I think steel is always, a stronger, better option for a lot of things, but for this, is it necessary? Probably not. Now, on the subject of mounts, I see a lot of the Leupold adjustable mounts, and I would generally advise against those. One of the big selling features of that mount is that you have some windage adjustment in the mount, that you can actually change the angle horizontally in the mount to adjust for some just gross change that you need to compensate for. And I think in a precision rifle, that's a bad thing way more than it's a good thing. If you're needing to do that with your scope mount, then it says there's probably an issue with your stock or your action or your barrel install. Left to right, you should not be having to angle your entire scope. Because if you're doing that, it means, you'll probably be able to get a good zero at one distance, but as you stretch it out further and further, that angle is going to increase and you'll just be further and further off. So I would stay with a one-piece rail that is not in any way, shape, or form adjustable for windage. So I ran with that TrueGlow stock on the factory rail with Warren mounts for quite a while. The next thing I kind of monkeyed with was the stock. So it came with a stock by Fab Defense that was basically just a cheap AR stock. So these chassis rifles, they have the buffer tube assembly, even though it's kind of a little bit silly on these rifles because it doesn't actually hold a buffer or a buffer spring or anything like that. It's just an empty tube for the purpose of fitting standard AR-15 type parts on the back end of your rifle. So it came with a Fab Defense stock. It did have an adjustable cheek piece, which I really liked, and it did have an adjustable length of pull, which I also really liked. I think those are both features that are basically required in a long-range precision gun. Either that or get a stock that's custom fit to you so that it actually fits you really well. I think going adjustable is a better way to do that, just because you can take something that's factory produced, crank it up, crank it down, make it longer, make it shorter, and make it fit you without having to do all the custom work. And if you loan it to somebody else, you can just put a couple clicks in it and it can fit them, and then you can bring it back and it can fit you. So I liked the adjustability, but in general, it was just kind of chintzy, cheap feeling plastic, and it was really loose and wobbly. And I just was not happy with the inconsistency between a really rock solid, consistent chassis, yet a really wiggly, flimsy buttstock on the rifle. So I wanted something that locked up a lot tighter, that felt like a higher grade of plastic, but was still adjustable. So I went looking at some of the usual suspects, brands that I had seen before, brands that I had seen at the range, but also brands that I had purchased from beforehand personally. I looked at the Luth AR stock. I thought it was pretty interesting. It was very adjustable. It's kind of a skeletonized design, but I wanted something that was a little bit more solid. So I went with a name that I trust and have used for a lot of different builds in the past, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it's because I've had good history with them. I went with the Magpul PRS stock. So this was the Magpul PRS, which I assume is precision rifle stock. Went with that right when they came out with the Gen 3. So they've had the Gen 1 and Gen 2 for a very long time, and it's basically just their adjustable stock platform that slides onto an AR-15 buffer tube. So went with that. But one thing I discovered that was a little bit weird about this Savage is that when you use a full-length PRS stock, so it's designed to be a drop-in replacement for something like an A2 stock or something of a similar length. But when I use that on this MDT chassis that actually comes back a little bit further on the pistol grip, it was just too long for me. And I was really confused by this. It came with two different adapters, and ultimately I figured out that those are for two different buffer tube sizes, not two different length adapters. And so I fiddled with it. I shortened it up as much as I possibly could, but it was still just too long. I was not able to put this thing up on a bench and get behind it in a way that just really felt comfortable. So that was a little bit of an issue. So like any good redneck, I busted out my Dremel tool and started jacking around with stuff. And I would advise against this if you don't specifically know what you're doing. But I ended up trimming down the stock on the action side of it. So not on the end that actually goes against your shoulder, but on the end where it just goes around the buffer tube up to the castle nut, up to the stock, up to the chassis, ended up cutting about a half an inch off of that and then reattaching it. And guess what? It worked just fine. And I'm 5'11", so I'm not a huge dude. I'd say I'm probably about an average size or slightly shorter or smaller than the average size American guy who's into guns. And so this length of pull actually fits me really, really well. And I have it sucked in almost all the way at the length of pull adjustment. I could go a tiny bit more, but for loaning this to somebody who's a larger frame shooter, there's a lot of room to basically go out to where it would have been factory. So that was an adjustment that I was really hesitant to make, busting out a Dremel and sawing down a $250 stock that I had just purchased, but I'm actually really glad I did it. So I've got Magpul on the back end of this thing, and then I ended up changing out the pistol grip as well. So the one it came with I think it was either a Hogue or an Ergo grip. It was that really soft, really grippy rubber texture, which I think is a great design. It's a great material for when you really want to hold on to something tight. But with a precision rifle, you don't want to do that. I think with an AR where you're running and gunning and you need to pick that gun up and manipulate it and change angles and move around with the gun a lot, really good to have a nice solid grip on it. But with a precision rifle, yeah, you want a way to hold it when you're moving the rifle around and manipulating it, but when you're actually going to take the shot, you want as little human influence on the grip as possible. So having that really sticky, really grippy texture, I kind of felt it was a disadvantage. So once again, I went Magpul. They've got that hard, rigid plastic. You can kind of hear it there. So it's definitely not soft and squishy and grippy at all. And I actually went with the Magpul K grip. It's a little bit more of a vertical angle than a standard AR-15 pistol grip. I'm not sure what the standard one is, but this is just a little bit more vertical than that. And it's significantly shorter. It's probably about 3/4 of an inch, maybe even an inch shorter than a standard AR-15 grip. And the Magpul K grip is marketed for a lot of pistol caliber carbines or just otherwise short, compact builds where you just don't want something big and chunky, and that vertical angle can give you a little bit more control. So I'm using this grip not for its intended purpose, but I liked that it was nice and short. It largely got out of my way because I didn't need a big pistol grip to maneuver this thing. And when I set it on the bench, I'm going to be using a bipod. And so I wanted the rifle basically to go bipod to buttstock in terms of the 2 points of contact on the bench. I didn't want it to go bipod to pistol grip. So I liked having that shorter pistol grip. So moving forward, I just mentioned the bipod. So in the first couple matches I saw, and the first couple times I took this to the range, I saw some of the cool kids using the Atlas bipod. And then I watched some YouTube videos about it, and it was all the rage. It was the cool thing to have, but I couldn't pay over $200 for a rifle bipod. I just couldn't see myself doing it. I didn't like the idea of it. There had to be another option. So I went on Amazon and I found something that looked the exact same and put it on there. And it was basically just a cheap Chinese knockoff of an Atlas bipod. And this is where I'm going to tell you, don't do it. The Atlas bipod is good for several reasons. And that design just cannot be machined cheaply out of shoddy materials. It requires a really solid lockup with solid machining. The cheap knockoff bipod, not only is it not giving money and credit to the original designers of the thing, it does not work like you want it to. At first, I thought it was just people being particular and really wanting to kind of support the original designers, but even beyond that, at just a level of function, it is not nearly as good. It is not as stable. It wiggles around when you don't want it to wiggle around. Just don't go there. Don't do it. I really don't recommend it. So the next thing I went to was a Harris-style bipod, and I mentioned this on my hunting rifle build. I had used a Harris-style bipod before, and it was actually one built by TrueGlow. That is a cheaper version of the Harris style, but it is the adjustable length legs that have the 1/2-inch notches, so it's not all or nothing. You can actually fine-tune the length that you want on your bipod legs, and it's the pivoting model, so you can compensate for your angle, which is really important in long-range shooting. So tried that out. It worked great. Honestly, I don't have any problem with it, other than that it was pretty bulky. So I ran that for a long time, and I've tried some other things kind of in between, and I had taken some things off and then kept going back to that TrueGlow Harris style bipod, and it worked pretty well. And then only recently did I change to the new Magpul bipod. When it first came out, I was really hesitant about it. I've probably already established, I'm kind of a fanboy for Magpul stuff. I like a lot of what they put out, but I was nervous about a bipod that was made primarily of plastic. It just did not seem like it would be rigid enough. I was nervous, and it wasn't until I actually saw one on another rifle and started messing around with it, kind of fiddling with it, getting a feel for it, getting a feel for the adjustment. So it's got a really solid snap-in system. It just folds back, and then it's got a push-button design where you can open and extend the legs, and then a knurled tension knob on the bottom that you can loosen to let it kind of freely pivot as much as you want, or you can really crank it down. And what I liked is on that adjustment, it could be done kind of anywhere between. It's not all or nothing. You actually have a significant adjustment range. So that was nice. I liked that. And then the one feature that really sold me, especially when I looked at the kind of knockoff outlets or some of these other ball joint type of bipods, is that you can actually change the pivot adjustment. So I think we need to clarify terms here. Pivot is different than pan. Pan is if you're laying prone with the rifle in front of you, looking down range. Pan is the amount that you can turn your body and the rifle to look left and right. Pivot is changing on a different axis to adjust whether your rifle is level or it's tilted on that axis side to side. So it's the pivoting is the level, the panning is the actual kind of traverse movement pointing in a different direction, left to right. So I like that you can actually flip over kind of this top disc, and you can change it so it can be pan and pivot, or just pivot with no pan, which is my preference. And that's kind of why I like the Harris style, because I found that a lot of times that pan feature would hurt me more than it would help me. So I think the idea of an articulating mount where you can pan and aim at various targets, it's a good idea, but then in practice, when you're shooting at one target and trying to be as accurate as possible, you shoot and then the recoil starts adjusting the pan of the bipod, and it starts just kind of free moving on you, and you got to keep messing with it. And is it workable? Absolutely. But it's just one more thing to mess with that I would rather not mess with. So I'm using the Magpul bipod and using it with the M-Lock system, which is a Magpul system. And they sell it in a couple of varieties. They sell one that clamps to the factory style sling swivel stud. I think they may have a Keymod model. They may not, because Keymod's kind of a competitor to M-Lock, even though Keymod's not really branded like M-Lock is. And then I know they definitely have a Picatinny version as well. So running that, generally, it's worked out really well for me. I've shot this rifle, I guess I've taken it to the range twice since I've had that on there, but I really like it. So next, let's look at a sling. So at the most basic level, a sling is how you lug your rifle around. I'd say for a hunter or a tactical shooter, a sling is much more than that. There are several ways that you can use the sling to balance the rifle to stabilize your shot. I think that's done a little bit in the category of precision rifles, but for me, this actually is mostly for just carrying the rifle, because when I'm going to shoot this thing, I'm either going to be on a bench or laying prone. I'm not really going to be trying to accomplish precision shooting while standing or sitting. So for me, it's really a way of lugging it around, but I think I had discussed this a little bit in my previous hunting rifle build episode, that I really like the Viking Tactics or VTAC 2-point sling. I really don't like 1-point slings, and even more than that, I despise 3-point slings. I think 2-point is the way to go. And what I really wanted on this rifle was quick detach. So I used the flush cups and a push button quick detach mount system so that I can easily take the sling off, get it out of my way, toss it aside, and then in just a second, I can clip it right back on. So I like that this sling is very adjustable on both ends and in the middle. And it has kind of a quick latch system where you can run it long, or you can suck it in and keep it nice and tight for close to body carry. And I like that on this gun purely because it's a very long, chunky rifle. And so I like the ability that when I'm carrying it on my back, if I was going to hike a ways holding this thing, carrying this thing, I could keep it nice and tight so it's not bouncing around. But then if I'm carrying this in a way where I actually want to be ready for a shot, I can just pull that tab, loosen it up, and it's nice and comfortable with a wide range of movement, and it's nice and flexible. So I talked a lot about this sling in my other episode, and I think that about covers it here. And yeah, of course I went with the multicam just because it looks cool, right? I know for long range precision shooting, a lot of people go with, you know, kind of these bright colors, these competition colors, because it's not a tactical thing. But for me, this rifle still kind of was. So I wanted this to be not just a competition bench rest rifle, but kind of a tactical class rifle that I could use for whatever. So yeah, I do kind of like the camo sling, but that's just kind of my deal. So looking at this rifle, we've kind of discussed everything from the buttstock to the pistol grip to the chassis. Still running the factory trigger on this thing. It's a Savage Accu trigger. I have it adjusted not all the way as light as it can go, but just above. Because when it was all the way as light as it could go, it felt a little bit mushy and inconsistent. So I brought it down there and then brought it up just a little bit, and it's still a super light, super crisp trigger. I guess I'm probably running it at probably about 2 pounds would be my guess. I haven't actually put a scale on it, but I don't really care what the number is. I just like the way it feels. So talked about the first optic I had, how I had that mounted on here. Before I get into the optic stuff a little bit more, kind of want to talk about what's on the far end of this boomstick. So I experimented with a couple things. I don't remember if this even came with a brake. I don't think it didn't. It just came with a thread protector, which was nice, but a thread protector is just that. It covers up the threaded barrel, and for people looking at a precision rifle like this, you don't need a threaded barrel, but it gives you options. It allows you to put a compensator or a suppressor on here. I really like having the options that it enables, but you don't need it. This rifle did have a threaded barrel, so I wanted to take full advantage of it. So I ended up doing a little bit of research, watched some videos. There's actually a really good video on YouTube. Unfortunately, I don't remember who put it out, but it was basically a test of all the precision compensators on the market showing how they reduce recoil, where they put all these things side by side. They found a way to kind of graph it using a lead sled, the amount it pushed it back. And it was really interesting. And, you know, there were some on there that were just fantastic, but were incredibly complex or incredibly expensive. So like I know the APA Little Bastard was one that was consistently ranked very, very highly. But let's be honest, I'm shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor. It does not recoil a lot. And in any competition rifle, the ideal amount of recoil is 0. You just want to know that the shot went off, but you don't want flinch. You want to be able to watch your shot. So it's not really a matter of like a hunting rifle, like the amount of recoil you can stand. It's wanting very little recoil so that you can actually watch your own shot. So I wanted something that was pretty effective, but I wasn't going to pay that much for a gun that was not dishing out a lot of recoil. So I ended up going with the Cross Machine and Tool CRB, or their competition recoil brake. So this was one in the testing that was consistently in the top 10 in terms of recoil reduction. Now I'm running a 6.5 Creedmoor, which is definitely smaller than the 308 size that this comes in. Is that really an issue? With a brake, I think not. I think with a suppressor, and if you were trying to get a suppressor to perform at its absolute best, I think, yeah, you've got some extra room where you're leaking out air and you're not going to be suppressing the sound of the rifle as effectively. But for a brake, you're mostly just trying to take those gases that are following the bullet and direct them out to the side. As long as you obviously don't want to ever go smaller than your bullet or be really, really close. But if you're a little bit larger than the diameter of your projectile, I think it's fine. So this retails for about $85, which is actually a pretty good price for a nicely machined precision muzzle brake that's very effective at taming recoil. But the one downside to this thing is kind of the same downside to all muzzle brakes. It's freaking loud. If you're shooting this on a bench right next to somebody, they're going to complain. Now, this rifle has a 24-inch barrel, so it's sitting a pretty good ways away from you. So from the shooter's perspective, if you're wearing ear pro, you're probably not going to really notice it. And this rifle kicks out exhaust gases to the side. So in general, from right behind it, you won't really notice it. But if you're right beside this thing, it's just going to drive you crazy how loud it is. But that's pretty much any effective brake is going to do that. So this is a 3-chamber design, so it lets a lot of those gases shoot out side to side. And man, it's effective on this gun. So there is very, very little recoil. I'd say it feels like a 223 or maybe even slightly less. And, a lot of that's because this is about a 10, 11-pound rifle. And so mass absorbs recoil, but the effectiveness of this brake is definitely noticeable. So in installing this brake, something that we need to talk about briefly is the timing of a muzzle brake. So with some compensators and a few different brake designs, they're basically 360 degrees. You just thread it on, no matter which way it's facing, it's going to be pretty effective. It's mostly going to work. But with something like this, where it's closed on the top and bottom, but has large ports kind of out to the sides, the angle at which you clock this is actually really important. So the best way to do this is to use a shim kit, not to use a crush washer. So if you look at an AR-15 barrel, they all come with that A2 birdcage flash hider, and they use a crush washer. That's fine for that, for just a very small, lightweight flash hider. But if you want something to be really precise and you're going to run a large, heavy brake on there, you don't want to impart tension on the barrel or on the brake. The goal is just to space it properly, just to get it oriented and facing the right direction, not to have anything overly tight or overly tense. So you don't want to use a crush washer. I'm using a shim kit from Gemtech. Now they sell them for muzzle brakes, for suppressors. Basically, it's just a series of really small washers that you slip over the barrel, and it's kind of a pain to get it right because basically you put one on, thread the brake on, tighten it, see where it ends up. Okay, it didn't go far enough. Okay, then take that one off, put a thinner one on, try it again. Oh, it went too far. Okay, now find something in between. And eventually you'll stack up these paper thin washers and then crank this thing down until it is oriented with the ports out to either side and flat on top. It takes a little while to set up right, but it's definitely worth taking the time to do it, just because that way you won't have any side-to-side jump. It'll be just nice and consistent on the recoil of your rifle. So got that set up. Unfortunately, in the process, I put a big old scratch on the side of that brake, and this thing is blued steel. The barrel on here, I don't know if it's parkerized or I guess it's a nitride coating is probably how I describe it. Now, I'm not a metallurgist, so I don't really know the technical names of these, but it's not a shiny blued finish, but the brake is. So that scratch is pretty noticeable on there, but whatever. This thing, I view it as a tool. Now, I don't want to ding it up and just abuse it and wreck it, but I'm not going to get upset whatsoever about a little scratch on the muzzle brake. So with all this, I pretty much had a rifle configured the way I liked it, but it was time to go to optics round 2. I like dinking around with optics, and it's something that I'm learning and changing and growing just like all of you. So I have some preferences in a hunting scope. I have some preferences in kind of a tactical carbine application, and it just took me a while of shooting this thing to really kind of fine-tune my preferences for a long-range precision rifle. And kind of during when I was first getting this set up, I watched a series of videos called Sniper 101 by Rex Tibor. So it's on YouTube. He has a channel called Tibosaurus Rex that's over 100 of these really long, in-depth videos that's just ballistic, super nerdy, long-range shooting stuff. He'll have a whole 40-minute episode talking about reading wind or talking about how to move your elevation turret properly. And so you really just got to stick with it and power through the nerdy stuff, but you'll learn a lot in the process if you listen to it. So that's Tibosaurus Rex. So I had listened to most of his content, and then he had a classroom shooting clinic followed by some live fire stuff. And this dude knows a lot. I've seen him partner with James Yeager. I think he may have had a partnership with Clint Smith from Thunder Ranch. I've seen him partner with a bunch of guys teaching long-range precision stuff because he really knows what he's doing. And some of the other speakers he had at this event were top-notch as well. Guys who had spent a long time in the sandbox, kind of, they know their way around the pointy end of a stick, I guess is the way to put it. They really know what they're doing. And so I learned a lot from his classroom seminar. I think it was RX 17. Yeah, I took it in 2017, and it was the first classroom series he did. He later went back and had an RX 18 and then some other on the range type of stuff. But I just went to the classroom session, and it was just a full weekend in the Bass Pro Shops classroom, just sitting there literally with a scientific calculator learning about long-range ballistics. And man, I learned a lot, and that really influenced my perspective on what I wanted in an optic. So I wanted something that was a mill reticle, and I wanted a turret that matched that. Now, if you prefer mills or MOA, it doesn't matter that much. You can. I kind of work in both systems. I have friends who really prefer MOA, so it takes me a little bit just kind of switch my train of thought. But really, as long as your reticle matches your turrets, that's what's important. So it's just like you wouldn't want to be driving down the road and your speedometer's in kilometers per hour, but the signs are in miles per hour. Sure, you could translate, but if you're doing that calculation all the time, you're not able to make quick and effective decisions, or there's at least one big barrier in the way between every decision you need to make. So it's important that they match. And then for me, it was important that my scope was in the first focal plane. If you're not familiar with what I mean by focal plane, again, that could be a whole nother podcast episode on its own. It's basically, is the scale of the reticle consistent to your eye, or is it consistent to your target? When you zoom the scope, are you zooming in on the reticle, or does the reticle stay the same and you zoom into your target? First focal plane means your reticle is fixed to your target. So as you zoom in, the reticle appears to change sizes, but it means it's consistent to your target, not to your zoom. So if you have a reticle that has subtensions in MOA, one MOA is one MOA, no matter if you're at 8 power or 18 power. And 1 mil is 1 mil, no matter if you're at 3 power or 15 power. It's consistent throughout its entire optical range. So the next thing was to look at reticles. There are a ton of great reticle designs on the market, and I've even drawn up some myself. And there's a lot of options, but ultimately it's kind of a user preference thing. There are some really complicated reticles by Horus or other companies that are generally known as Christmas tree style reticles that have kind of a whole ramp of where you can look at different elevation adjustments. You can kind of see the windage all the way out on both sides. I don't prefer that reticle just because it's a whole lot to look at. And if you're trying to read it and make decisions quickly, it's just too much. Now, you do need a grid. You do need some sort of measuring system. And like I said, either MOA or mills, either's fine, just as long as it matches your turrets. But I want a simple grid, the simplest thing that I can read quickly. So I guess that would technically be a mill dot system. The dots I don't think are as precise as hash marks. So that's kind of, when I looked at that feature set, first focal plane, mill reticle, mill turrets. I guess I haven't talked about magnification range. I wanted something above 10 power. Now, 10 power, you can absolutely do a lot. I think a lot of people overestimate the power of magnification. And I think having good, sharp, crisp glass is more important than having high magnification. If my budget was $500, I would rather have a $500 3 to 10 than a $500, 6 to 24. Just because when you start zooming in at that extremely high magnification, but you don't have good quality glass, well, you're just zooming in on bad glass, and it's not going to help you as much. So magnification range, I did want something much higher power than I would use on a hunting scope, but I wasn't going to go all out with one of those like 30x or 24x or anything like that. A 5 to 25 is pretty common in military grade precision, long range sniper rifles. And so I figured that was kind of a good point to start with, that or something less than that. And so I just kind of looked at the options out on the market. And again, the exact magnification level was something that I was willing to be a little bit flexible on, as long as I had a good quality scope with repeatable, consistent turrets, a good reticle, like I said, mil. I did want a 50 millimeter objective, and so what I ended up finding was the Leupold LRP series. So for all those features, it's pretty darn affordable. It's just under $1,000. I think it was normally, I want to say it was like $950, and I got it for $899 at the time. It's probably come down a little bit some since then. So this scope is available in several different configurations. I think it's a 4 to 14, a 6.5 to 20, and an 8 to 24, I believe. Because it's on the VX3 system, it's a 3-power multiplier, so it does not have a huge adjustment range. But again, that's something I was a little bit flexible on. So I ended up going with the 6 to 20, and I don't regret that decision. I think it's worked really well. There's on occasion when it would be nice to have over 20 power, but it's rare. And I don't think I've ever had a single shot where I can objectively say, I was at 20x. If I had more magnification, that would have been the difference between making the shot and not. I don't think that's ever actually legitimately happened. Anytime I've wanted more magnification, it was just to have a better look at something, not to actually make me more accurate. And sometimes you want to zoom out a little bit if you're trying to look for your own trace or see impact, see where your shot's hitting. You're not going to be able to do that if you're zoomed all the way in at 24x or even 15x sometimes. So that's kind of a reason why I was flexible in the magnification range, but also a reason why first focal plane was really important. So I ended up going with the 6.5 to 20, like that range. And then another thing that was important is a side focus or side parallax adjustment, so that instead of the rifle being a fixed parallax at 100 yards, I could easily adjust the parallax. So of parallax adjustment styles, there are some that are kind of on the objective end of the scope, where it's like a camera lens. You just turn the whole end of the lens and it changes your parallax setting. And there are some that are side focus. I really like side focus just from the fact that when you're sitting there like you're going to shoot the gun, you can reach up and quickly adjust it if you need to. And I think if it's hard to adjust your parallax, you're less inclined to do it. Parallax is something that I think is very easily forgotten. Now, if you're like a pro level competition shooter, like you probably know to check that all the time. But if you're like me and haven't been shooting long range precision stuff for a long time, you're going to check your wind, you're going to check your dope, you're going to check all that stuff. But I think parallax is something easily forgotten. So I wanted it to be very easy to access and easy to change. Now, with the scope, the one kind of it would be nice if feature that I would have liked that this did not have is an illuminated reticle. But that's something that was kind of a low level on my list of priorities. Would have been nice if I could find something that tracked as well as this, that had a good mil reticle, good mil turrets, 50 millimeter objective, good glass, all these features, plus an illuminated reticle. And there are several out there. It's not for lack of a product. It just came down to budget. I needed to keep it under $1,000, and I couldn't find something that had all those features in a way that I wanted, that also had an illuminated reticle for under that price range. Now, that was 3 years ago, so there may be some new stuff out. I've seen some of the new SIGs. They're pretty nice. Some of the new Burris stuff's pretty nice. There's a bunch of options out there. Heck, even Brownells has a pretty nice looking line of precision rifle scopes. But really just figure out the features that you want, that you have to have, and the features that you're willing to flex on, and then don't compromise once you know the difference between those two. Another feature on the scope that I neglected to mention is the windage. So I talked about the turrets, that they're in mil radian. So one click is 0.1 mils. But what I liked about this design on this LRP is that the windage is open, but it's also threaded so it can be capped. Now for a target style application, I'm going to run it open so that I can make those adjustments nice and easily. But I like that design so that within the same scope, you can kind of choose to run it either way. So thought that was pretty cool. And then also on the windage, I really like the way it's labeled. It's not just labeled 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2. It's actually labeled 0.5R, 1R, or going the other direction, 0.5L, 1L, 1.5L. So that if you dial in an adjustment in your windage, you can look back on it and actually know, okay, I've adjusted 1 mil, but was it left or right? Obviously, that's not as important in elevation because anytime you're dialing, you're dialing up. So you're giving yourself elevation above your zero. But with windage, it could go either way. So if you've dialed quite a bit and you're looking at it and it just says 3, well, is that 3 left or 3 right? It makes a huge freaking difference. So I really like just the simple thing of how they've labeled that. So been pretty happy with this optic. Mounted on the optic, I also have I believe it's by Lone Star Precision. It's just a bubble level mounted on the scope. So first of all, when you install your scope, it's critically important that you get your scope level. For hunting rifle stuff, I think it's very important, but for long range precision stuff, it's even more important. And heck, for archery, it's really important. There's a reason why every single archery sight on the market pretty much has a bubble level built into it. If you're trying to be precise and you're dialing up, but you're not dialing exactly up, it's hard to be precise. If you keep dialing and you're imparting a little bit to left or a little bit to right when you think you're dialing up, you're just not going to ever be as accurate as you think you are. So having that level is really important in mounting your scope. But then after you get your scope and mount and rifle leveled to each other, it's important so that when you're laying on the side of a hill looking downrange at a target, you can make sure that your rifle is actually sitting up straight, especially with hills that are at competing angles where it's kind of hard to read the lay of the land. You may think you're level, but a bubble level may reveal that, nope, in fact, you're actually nowhere close. So that's really, really good to have because it helps keep you consistent, because no matter where you are in the world, gravity is going to be consistent. So it lets you align to the one thing that's truly a constant so that your scope is always going to be level to the center of the earth. So that sounds over technical and overly complicated, but it's a simple thing that just keeps you on target, keeps you holding your gun up straight, and keeps you shooting accurately. So with the scope setup, the scope and the level, I'm pretty happy with how it's performed. One thing that it does have that is a feature that some people like, some people don't like, is it doesn't have flip-up style lens caps. It comes with the kind of bikini style caps where it's just 2 caps, one on each end, held with elastic bands. I actually don't really mind that for this sort of setup. So flip-up caps, if they're the cheap plastic ones, I'm not a fan of them. I tend to just kind of take them off and forget about them. If you have a soft neoprene cover, I like that on a scope, but part of the design of the LRP is that the elevation turret is kind of stupid tall. The way it indexes, it has kind of a skirt that moves down as you adjust, but the top always stays very tall. So I see why they didn't really want to go with that for this design. So I really don't mind these style of caps. I think the next upgrade I might do on this rifle, but it's very much a might because it doesn't really solve any problem. It's just kind of a cool thing I'd like to have, would be the aluminum flip-up caps by Leupold. So those are pretty cool. I just like that it's a really sturdy, rock-solid flip-up style cap that's held closed by a magnet. Pretty cool design, but ultimately it's not anything I'm rushing out to get. So I think from that, man, we've discussed this whole rifle. We talked about the barreled action, we talked about the mount, we talked about the rings, we talked about the scope, we talked about the level that I've got on there, talked about the trigger, the factory trigger, talked about the chassis, the buffer tube, the stock, the sling, the bipod, the muzzle brake, even the shim kit holding the muzzle brake in place. But the one thing we haven't talked about yet is the magazine system and the ammo I run in this thing. So one thing that makes me a little bit different from a lot of competition shooters is I wanted something that could shoot factory ammo. So I don't reload. I totally could. I've got enough hobbies between doing podcast stuff, video stuff, bow hunting, long-range rifle stuff, boating and fishing and camping and hiking. I'm going to buy ammo. I think Hornady or Federal, they can probably make ammo pretty darn well these days. And so, yeah, I was kind of restricting myself to factory ammo. Now, I do know that if I took the time to hand load stuff, I could build something specifically tuned to this rifle that would perform a little bit better. But that wasn't one of my goals. And if you look at basically any military sniper type application, guess what? They're not hand loading ammo. Yeah, they're using precise, high quality, match grade rounds, but it's stuff that's supplied to them on a truck. It's not loaded specifically for that exact gun where they're measuring out, tenths of a grain of powder and changing the distance to the lands on the bullet seating depth. They're not doing any of that. So I wanted to figure out kind of what some of the best shooting rounds on the market that are within my price range. Because of course, ammo is another one of those things where you can get it dirt cheap and, it'll still work. It'll still work great. But is it going to be as accurate and is it going to be clean? Yeah, probably not. Or you can pay kind of as much as you want for high quality custom shop stuff. So I wanted to find something that was high end, but was also fairly easy to find. Didn't have to be like in Walmart or anything like that, but something that, Cabela's would more likely or not have it, or I could order from Brownells or something like that. So I ended up doing some ammo testing. I actually didn't do as much ammo testing with this gun as I did with the 270 when I was working on that project, because this gun, I was fortunate to find what I like very quickly. So a lot of that was just in doing research, finding what other people were liking, and knowing that my rifle was a 24-inch 1-8 twist, 6.5 Creedmoor, obviously. I could look at other people who were shooting rifles of those same specs and kind of figure out what bullet weight they liked. And a lot of people kind of said that they preferred the heavy stuff, that it was more consistent for long-range precision. Now, if you're building up a gun for hunting and it just happens to be in 6.5, 6.5 isn't better for hunting. It's not bad, but I would say there's no advantage of a 6.5 compared to like a 243 or a 7mm 08. It's kind of all the same for a basic hunting application. Now, 6.5 is a very efficient flying bullet and does have some advantages for long-range precision stuff, and that's where I found that it tended to like the heavier bullets. It liked the kind of 130 and up. I know there's a 129, there's some 130s, I think there's a 134, and then I started looking at some of the Hornady options because the 6.5, that whole project was largely, it wouldn't have happened without Hornady. I sincerely believe that like 6.5 is so popular now, but Hornady really got it going. So they were on the forefront of knowing what worked well, so I immediately gravitated towards Hornady match ammunition, and that's kind of where I found the winner. I went with the ELD match, and they have an ELD X that's more of a hunting style bullet and an ELD match, and honestly, looking at them, they look the exact same. I can't tell you the difference between them, but I've killed a deer with a match grade bullet, and guess what? It worked just fine. So I'd rather go with the one that they call a match bullet and use that for hunting than go with the one that they call a hunting bullet and try to use that as a match round or expect it to be a match round. So I tried that in the 140, and there's also another option, the Hornady Black, which is their kind of slightly cheaper. And it's not cheap, but it's more affordable than the ELD match. And it actually shot pretty well. So the Hornady Black is an open tip. So it's basically an open tip boat tail, I think is what they call it. So kind of a standard hollow point, not a soft point, just a hollow point. So it looks like an FMJ with a little pinhole in the front of it. And it actually shot pretty good for $20 a box ammo. I was getting it to group about MOA or slightly over MOA. But for a bit more, I could definitely get the rifle to shoot under MOA by using that ELD match stuff. And I found that ELD match was also, and I'm not sure if it's just part of the packing and shipping procedures, box to box, it was a little bit more consistent. So that's what I was running kind of early on. I experimented a little bit with some other stuff, but frankly, that's what I'm still running today because it works great. That ammo, the variability in the ammo is less than the variability in myself. So I absolutely trust that ammo. I've killed a deer with it. I've shot steel with it. I've shot short ranges, long ranges. It's all in all been great stuff, and it's about $30 a box. I can order it online. I can find it in a lot of places. So for a factory load, it solves a lot of the things I was looking for. So this chassis system has a large magazine catch and a large mag well that is designed to take the Accuracy International platform of magazines, just a standard box style magazine. And I really like that. So of precision rifle setups, the Accuracy International platform is kind of the standard. There are some other ones out there. And actually, when I was looking at that Rock River Arms LAR 8M N65 Creedmoor, that was kind of one of the things that I thought was a little bit odd about it. It looked like an AR-15. It worked like an AR-15. Everything except the magazine, which it took an FAL magazine, which I thought was really bizarre. But ultimately, all of these things, it's going to be based on a 308 magazine because a 6.5 is just a neck down 308 when you really look at it. So as long as you basically choose short action or long action, I would say Accuracy International is kind of the standard. So I was excited that this went with that. Now, I have heard a little bit of feedback that there are some magazines that work better than others, that any metal magazines don't work as well. And I think if you're putting them in a metal chassis, I don't know, it may be just a metal on metal. You kind of need one to give and the other not to give. So I was looking at some of the Magpul options. I honestly have not tried out the Magpul P-Mags in the Accuracy International platform. I love them for ARs. They are really reliable, really consistent. They're a great mag for ARs. But I saw that MDT actually made a mag, and to me, that was the go-to. So I got an extra one of those, and I've been thrilled with it. So I went with that just because I figured the chassis is made by MDT. If they're going to check for compatibility on anything, it's going to be their own magazine. So went with that. I think the original one, it was probably the exact same thing. Of course, it was branded with Savage on the side of it, but went back and ordered that other MDT one, and I'm pretty sure it's the exact same thing. And they call it a 9-round magazine. It can actually fit 10. You can really squeeze it in there, and it will work. But loading it into the gun, you don't get a nice positive click. You kind of got to mash it in place. So I think it was intended from the factory to be a 10-round magazine. Then people complained about how tight it was, and they said, no, it's a 9-round magazine. But I discovered that it does work either way. I tend to just load them with 9, but I've loaded them either way, and it works just fine. So in terms of storing this rifle, I keep the whole thing in one of those large Plano weather guard cases. So Pelican is a known name in this style of case, as is SKB. I think SKB may be a little bit better for this sort of application just because they're known for being a little bit lighter weight. This Plano, I think they came out with these all-weather tactical series. I have a couple of them. I have 2 of them for ARs. I have this one. I think they started getting into this when some of those Pelican patents were up. And it's a glass-filled nylon injection-molded case. So it is really durable. It's waterproof. The whole thing is foam-lined. It came with that pick and pluck foam, but in the process of customizing that, I kind of messed that up and then ended up having to refoam it. The one thing I don't like about this case is how heavy it was. So it's super durable. I like it for how I actually use it. I can take a precision rifle and throw it in the bed of my truck and not worry about it, which is pretty important because when you have everything this finely tuned, you are tempted to just baby it. But when I go out to the range or out to a pasture or I'm banging around in my truck, I'm not babying gear, so I wanted something rugged. So I like it for those aspects, but it's so darn heavy. If I were to do the same type of build today and I didn't already have this case, I already have it, so of course I'm going to keep using it. But if I were to tell you what to buy, I'd say, yeah, look at the Pelican or SKB if you can afford it. If not, march your ass down to Harbor Freight with that coupon in your hand and get their Apache case. So it looks just like an SKB. It's molded just like an SKB, but it's no name. It's made in the same way, and it's definitely a lot lighter than the Plano all-weather gun guard case. So goodness, I have sat here and talked about my rifle setup for over an hour now. We went over just about every feature on this, the ammo I use, the case I stored it in, the way I have it set up. And I'm really happy with this rifle. It's fun to shoot, super accurate, and it keeps me excited about long-range shooting. I want to go out and shoot it again. As I'm sitting right here with this rifle in my hand, I can't wait for the next time I get to go out to the range and shoot this thing. And so it's not intimidating, it's not overly technical, yet it still is high quality and has everything I want. So I hope you found this interesting. Whether you're just another long-range precision shooter and you want to find somebody else who will also tell you about how much they love 6.5 Creedmoor, or if you're just getting into this for the first time and you just want to learn, hey, what do other guys have on this guns, why'd they choose it, and how's it working for them? I hope this was helpful. So again, it's a lot of talk about just one gun, but it's a topic I'm passionate about and a topic that can be really detailed and really technical. But I enjoy it, and I can't wait to get on the range and shoot it again. Until next time, stay safe, be free, and never stop seeking adventure.